Hi, I'm A. David Lewis. I'm with the MCPHS University, Program Coordinator for the MHS program. Enough about me. I'm going to start with a quick quote. To someone working in the UK health system, where the advertising of prescription drugs is banned, for now, and where healthcare is free at the point of access and prescriptions subsidized for free, the US system seems outrageous. The cost of medication, the working in a job one hates to get insurance is anathema. I want to push books like this and a handful of American cancer narratives into the hand of politicians who wish to stimulate a health insurance market that mimics the American model and shout at them, "Is this what you want?" The book, held out by Dr. Ian Williams, from whom the quote was derived. He's the originator of graphic medicine. The book is, of course, Rachel Lindsay's RX, a graphic memoir published in 2018 by Grand Central Publishing. It has been praised by Kirkus Reviews, Publishers Weekly, and New York Magazine, among others. Ms. Lindsay is the keynote speaker at the upcoming Graphic Medicine Comic-Con at UMass Medical School in April, and a featured guest at the Toronto Comic Arts Festival, TCAF. She also creates a weekly comic strip, Rachel Lives Here Now, from 2013 and ongoing, that appears in Vermont's alternative newspaper, 7 Days. Columbia University, the Miami Book Fair, and Mount Sinai Hospital have all embraced her work, and I'm personally delighted that MCPHS University's Center for Health Humanities and the Harvard Medical School's Capway Library are doing likewise today. Graphic medicine is at the forefront of medical education's future, and Americans confronting the healthcare system, and RX is one of its finest new expressions. Ladies and gentlemen, and variations thereof, please welcome my friend Rachel Lindsay.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to Deanne and Matthew and David for having me, and for all of you being here today. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my book and the process of making it, and then I'd just love to hear from you as well. How many of you recognize this ad for Pfizer's antidepressant, Stylistic? Yep. This wind-up doll mascot of the depressed looking in a mirror at a happier self. Or maybe this Abilify ad with the creeping hole of depression. And also note the way that the doctor is, her hand is outstretched and holding like that in such a bizarre way, and they're both wearing heels. Or how about Sarah Quill's cloud campaign? Or maybe these. I drew this batch myself, and most of them are based on real ads, but a couple of them are off the cuff. And I feel pretty confident about the way that they portray mental illness because I've seen a lot of psychopharmaceutical ads, and I see them with the dual consciousness of being both a consumer of those pills and a former member of a team that helped to push them. My book, RX, covers a time in my life where I wore both hats, working for an advertising agency on Pfizer's Stylistic campaign while secretly carrying my diagnosis of bipolar 1. It did not end well. It's been interesting over the past 6 months since the book has been out, speaking in front of these medical audiences, because I associate speaking to a bunch of doctors with being in a psych ward where I appealed for my release with as much composure as was possible for someone who had, even to the point of my commitment, followed every rule to avoid that situation, especially with regards to my health care. With my diagnosis at age 19, I abandoned my dream of being a cartoonist and reprioritized my life around maintaining my sanity. I was locked into a system that I saw no escape from, that required me to have health insurance by any means necessary. I had accepted my fate. But there is something about dealing in the commercialized images of my own suffering that made me consider the choices that I had made and the way that I was conducting my life anew. That made me realize that I couldn't sit at that desk anymore and drove me insane. I made a promise to myself in the psych ER the moment that I was committed that I would write this book, that I would share the insight that I had gained as a participant in both the capitalist and medical systems that dictate mental health treatment in this country, and to offer a rebuttal to the existing narratives around my life that were imposed upon me, and do it in my own terms and in my own language of comics. So I've been making comics for my entire life, and I've been using them in every application possible since I was a little kid. I made them for my friends and family. I made them instead of papers in grade school. I had a comic strip in my high school paper. I currently have a comic strip. My undergraduate thesis was a comic. And I also do freelance work doing kind of more nonfiction comics for businesses and people in my community. So when I started doing RX in earnest, when I got my book deal, I really didn't think that it would be any different than any other assignment that I had had, except for the fact that RX was about the greatest trauma in my life. So I had told the story of RX so many times, just verbally, and written about it some. But once I sat down to commit this to paper as a comic, it was like I was telling this story for the first time. And because it was this way that I had expressed myself from the point of a child, it really felt like my most authentic expression of self. And having depicted myself in this way as a cartoon character for my entire life, and I think people who make autobiographical comics will understand this expression of self is really more authentic. It feels more authentic to me than my physical body. There is a continuity in this drawing that has, the longevity of being with me throughout my entire life, and rendering my character of myself into these situations was almost like I was forcing that secret, authentic self to live this. And it was a visceral experience, completely re-traumatizing, and perhaps even harder than actually being in the hospital. So David had mentioned graphic medicine and the work that's being done there. And I feel like a lot of times graphic medicine, there's kind of an emphasis on solely the interplay of words and images, and that there is this kind of interstitial space there that can hold unnameable emotions. And I always felt prior to beginning RX that that's kind of an appropriate place for trauma to fall. But when I started and when I realized how difficult it was, I ended up really relying on a totally different but completely essential element of comics making, which was the panel and sequencing of panels and pages of sequences of panels. And by definition, a comic is a sequence of panels containing words and images that convey a narrative. And that is what comics are. And in the panel, this is a unit of time. And as someone who's retelling a life experience, having control over time and the way that I am conveying this to people, I can zoom in and zoom out. I can break apart these panels and reorganize information in a way that brings emphasis to different things that I feel are important. it's a way of translating memory. And as someone, I have a photographic memory, and when I am dealing with traumatic events, I'm remembering all of these experiences visually. And when I just have these images that occur to me, and having the ability to translate those and bring that to the forefront of what this experience was really important to me and completely essential to having this externalized. So just a quick crash course in visual storytelling with regards to structuring. This space here between the panels is called the gutter. And if we're thinking of these panels as a moment in time, this is a suggested pause. So as opposed to this format, where I think you can tell just by looking at it, your eye is kind of doing a different thing. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is sort of like cognitive relationships with reading visual information. So it's sort of difficult for me to completely convey. But the wider this gutter, the longer that you kind of feel that you can spend on one panel versus another. And here you're just being thrown straight through this information. This is a democratic grid. And a democratic grid structurally privileges information in each of these panels in an equal way. And you'll see that also all of the gutters are the same. So if you're reading through this, it's creating a time signature for you to absorb that information. And that's as opposed to a hierarchical grid where the structure privileges various aspects of the narrative in a hierarchy. So here I could be drawing attention to a penny on the ground and drawing a skyscraper here. And so it can be just like the relationship could be something that's emphasizing a thematic point, or it could be based on what's necessary for the information to be conveyed. Like if this was a ladder, that would be an appropriately sized panel. So there's also a consideration given to the way that you choose to integrate text into the panels. And you'll see that here, this is a style that you've probably encountered if you've read graphic novels. The text and the image are really almost segregated in a way that would encourage you to just get into this rhythm of kind of reading across the top, and you're sort of losing the connection between these two images. I mean, the text and the image. And that's as opposed to this more integrated approach where you're encouraged to interact with the image and the words in a way that draws you across the page, and it front loads the visual here, then the text, then the visual, and kind of keeps you again in this rhythm, in this percussive kind of absorption of this information. And then down here you have this again with those equal paces. And then my favorite, the line, which is just infinitely expressive. And I always tell my students that line is king, because it really, really is. And if you can learn to manipulate this, then the level of expression you can achieve in your work is really incredible. So having made comics for so long, I have sort of internalized that grid. And over the course of reading different comics that use the grid and put information into that grid, the text and the image, in different ways, have just sort of started to think about storytelling and thinking, in this structuring. And for my strip, for example, the amount of space that I have in the paper, I have 8 panels maximum comfortably. And so when I think about an idea and I think about telling a story, I've internalized the amount of space and the rhythm that I have to turn that phrase in. And I'm used to that pacing. So when I set out to do the book, I was going from a maximum of 8 panels to a 256-page narrative, just cold. And I had to figure out how I was going to make that work for myself. So similarly, I found a way to break down the page in ways that were, comfortable for me. This being my maximum of the democratic grid. Here's another version of that, and another one here, and then variations of that throughout. But just to go back to this one, when I would design my pages, these are thumbnails. That's what they call these drawings. And for me, every time that I began a chapter, I knew that I was starting on, this says, the right-hand page, that's what that R is. And then I would make these spreads and then go throughout. And I often knew what I had to hit in terms of the page amount. So I had all of these kind of structures in place to help me organize that thought. And again, it was so traumatic, but at least I had, in the terms of trauma language, I had containers for that trauma. And the container for that trauma was this grid and structuring. So here's just the one that I netted out with at the end, where I just kind of did a combination of all of those. And all of this stuff here is not bite marks, just to be clear. That's where I light boxed the book. So I did these pencil drawings, and then I put those onto a light box that the light comes through, and then I would trace it onto the Bristol board. But this was how I would make the grid lines after doing the kind of sketched versions on the pencil. So I just want to take you through some of the decision making with the structuring that I like in particular. And these are non-consecutive pages. But one of the things that I wanted to get across was the fact that I was compliant in taking my medication throughout the entire experience, up to the point of being hospitalized. And I didn't want to do it in a way that was totally overt. I wanted to show it as this part of my life that had become this sort of robotic exercise. And in that way, this chug, crush, toss just kind of plays back this mechanized thing that had become a part of my daily life. It was just so simply reduced to this. And so I use this as a motif throughout the book that introduces my relationship to my medication, shows the continued relationship that I have to my medication, and ultimately resulted in this. It was a part of the breakdown that I had, and giving a wink to that, and here is an alternate solution. This section comes after an intervention that preceded my hospitalization, and that's my father. And so there's a long portion of dialogue in the scene that precedes this. And when I was drawing this scene and this particular panel, most of my pages, the pencil pages that I would trace, were pretty, it was just a piece of paper with pencil on it. But this one, I cut out a bunch of times. Like, I had to reconstruct it because it was so difficult for me to draw this emotionally. And you can see just in the tactile, the actual physical page represents how difficult that was for me. And I had to get up from my desk every 2 minutes and walk around my house because I was almost physically ill. And this is the perfect example of how, revisiting this time and drawing this appeal to you. Is this okay? This felt like it was a very intense moment. But I often in the book, and I think that this is, part of the reflection of me trying to convey the emotional state of mania. These are, again, those quick panels, and they're equal size. It's suggesting kind of this equal moment, the same amount of time in each one. These are like simultaneous emotions almost. And that's what it felt like, disbelief and then anger And I'll get into that a little bit more later. But so you'll notice that at this point, dialogue scene, and then this becomes completely wordless. And so the visual is now leading you, and the visual is being controlled by the way that these panels are designed. So you can see in this scene here, where there's a lot of attention being given to these police officers that ended up coming. And then here you can see that there's this density that's happening in the drawing that's just kind of starting to reflect the claustrophobia that I'm experiencing, and is just drawing you through all of these panels and then bringing you to this moment where it's like this wide angle shot of what is being revealed to me. And it really did feel like I was, this was the director moment of all of this. And then again, just this wide angle with this moment of pause, which is not happening in any of these other places. You're just pausing and absorbing this information. And then I'm in the ambulance, and then you open and you're at the hospital. And from this point on, going from that moment of extreme density to this moment, this complete wall, I wanted everyone to feel like they hit that wall with me. Just removing, clinicalizing and sterilizing all of those emotions that you were just feeling. Guess where you are now? So this is one of my favorite sequences in the book, and it's one of the only pages that features, one of the only sections that features one panel on each page. And this is looking in a mirror, obviously. And so, the first consideration that I had there was that I wanted these panels to mirror one another. But I also wanted them to have this white space around them there's just something about focusing on this image that, really this face here, this is my favorite. I just love this sequence. And so you see, here I am looking in the mirror and seeing this squiggle, which I used to represent mania. And then I put on these sunglasses, and there's this transfer of my perception of myself. And, figuring out how to face the world when that's what you're seeing of yourself, and how are you going to contend with reality. And so these are also these reflective glasses. So talking again about structuring, I wanted this narrative to have a particular pace to it, because I wanted it to, I wanted people to understand, if they couldn't rationally understand what it's like to have a mental illness and have a manic episode, I wanted them to emotionally understand through this book. And given that, I wanted it to feel like that train wreck of an experience that it was for me, where everything is just imploding, and you're just, everything is just so rapidly falling apart around you. And since I wanted to keep that pacing, I had to truncate certain experiences that were related, that happened during that time. And so in this conversation with my psychiatrist, I'm reflecting on 3 separate events that happened that were very important to that moment, but ultimately meant the same thing. They all had the same outcome, which was, an extreme falling out with these people who were important to me in my life. And so using these tools in comics, I kind of tee it off here, and this is what I'm talking about with line being king. I'm sure that you know this sort of scalloped edge of thought bubbles. So what I'm saying there is, I begin with the typical speech bubble, and then it's kind of teeing off this dual, my memory and my understanding of this event, truncated to, be a pattern, here. And it's integrating these multiple realities that were at work, and the secrecy that you have to have as someone who is mentally ill and are trying to protect yourself in a moment where you feel threatened. So Here's another example of the comics tools of line work. This is the opening scene to the book, and I knew right away that I wanted people to know that I was manic in this experience. I did not want to suggest that I was not having a manic episode. And so right away, I drew this intake scene, but I was unsure how I could introduce this in a way where, I could have the rationalized reality and then a portrayal of what I perceived was not necessarily how it came across. And so here I have again this, explanation of my circumstance, and then this, which usually indicates a flashback or a fantasy. And again, these are all comics conventions that people have internalized over time. So you can see in my flashback what was actually going on, and that, it's being portrayed as something that wasn't quite rational. So one of the things that I did in preparation for writing the book, when I got to the hospital section, was I requested my notes. And all I did was write to the hospital, and they sent them to me. And I spent the summer trying to digest them. And reading these notes was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. And given where I'm at now, and when I was reading this, there's a note in there that said that I was delusional because I wanted to show my cartoon portfolio to the New Yorker. If I had believed that, I would not be here. But that was a medical note. I just want to bring that up. I had this problem of perception throughout the book where I'm trying to negotiate different realities that, again, these narratives are being imposed upon me. And so when I got to the hospital, I wasn't sure how I wanted to deal with these notes. And these are my actual hospital notes that I put in here. And there are other, Girl Interrupted by Susanna Kaysen, if anyone's ever read that, excellent book. I love the movie too, but the book is amazing. She actually takes her hospital notes and photocopies them and puts them in there. And so I was familiar with that tactic. I also know, for example, Alison Bechdel's work where she will draw documents and integrate them in that way. And so I wanted to figure out how I could do this in my own way. And so what I netted out with was relying on, again, these visual tools of making, graphic novel work by having this clipboard to contextualize the information that appears there. And so here again, you now have, after 100 or so pages, developed a relationship with me, this character. And rather than this, where it describes me, 23-year-old Caucasian woman, recently single, newly unemployed advertising account manager, living with roommates, carrying diagnosis of bipolar and ETOH dependent, with 2 previous psychiatric hospitalizations, most recently at St. Luke's Roosevelt in 2010, no essays, BIBA, after parents called 911, the setting of several weeks of increasingly manic behavior. This is what you're seeing. So there's something, you have compassion for this character. You feel something for this moment and this information. And you know that I'm manic, but don't you feel something? And here, this was, when I figured out how to do this, I got up from my drawing table and I dropped my pencil and I was like, yeah, just so you know, there were triumphs in this process, and this was one of them. And so here you can see this is all being described. Again, I'm still giving this wink to the fact that I'm manic. That's the motif. And then here I am portraying the manic episode, and there I am, escaping the clipboard, escaping this perception. And here I've dropped off the clipboard. And another important aspect, I should read this, okay. So it says, there's a previous page to this where it kind of introduces how I arrived in the hospital, but She becomes tearful when describing how difficult it is to live with her diagnosis. And then again, this replay of what you have realized is, the key issue for me. Just that is what it is. She does not believe that she needs to be in the hospital. Here's the manic reflection. There's mania that is happening. She is clearly in the middle of a manic episode. There are all of the different feelings that are happening simultaneously. Anger that is so violent, not really violent, but emotionally intense that these flames are breaking the panel. So I jump off the clipboard and it says, given her wish to make decisions with significant impact on her future while in this state, I was able in this circumstance to, with this visual, medium, bold these different statements, which if you read this bolded, her wish to make decisions on her future, her psychiatrist's inability to manage her. So that's what I wanted to bring forth from these actual notes. So there I am. Hospitalization is indicated for stabilization and medication adjustment. And then you see me look up and this hand of God picks me up. And then here I am. And then I'm dropped. And this is my new reality. And this is what you see when I enter the hospital. That now this is where I live, on that page in that clipboard. So I want to read, this is one of the sections that really took me a long time to get to the bottom of. And one of the criticisms that came up from my cartoonist peers and also my editor in the process of writing the hospital section was that I was really angry. There was a lot of anger. And that it was perhaps not palatable for every reader. And so knowing that anger was righteous, how do I unpack that and really get to the bottom of it and play it back in a way that is not frightening to people, that won't make them lose compassion for me? And so it took me several months to write this. But this is the section called The Fool, and it's basically the thesis statement for the book. And if anyone is into tarot, you'll recognize that this is a play on the Fool card, which is actually 0, not 7, but that's because this is chapter 7. And this is a play on it where I'm, walking off this building, and I had come to the hospital with that backpack, and actually these X's on the music notes there is how you play the drums. If you're looking at drum tablature, that's what that is. It's easier to be angry than sad. That first morning, I awoke into a nightmare that had less to do with my surroundings than the complete failure of the system I had been led to believe would protect me from this fate. And you can see here that the bedrock of this statement is this face, this moment of complete disbelief. And that feeling, I can't describe that feeling in words. Despite the psychiatrist I hadn't stopped seeing, despite the pills I hadn't stopped taking, I sat tagged and over-medicated in a new prison, waiting to be corrected to fit someone else's definition of sanity. For a few precious hours, I felt the freedom of a truly independent life, a life without my job, a life without my diagnosis. I was a fool to think it would last. I fucking hate everyone! And you'll notice here that my most extreme anger and emotion, and this was one of the original pages that I drew. I drew this years before I got the book deal. And this was, me attempting, I am being contained in this situation. And these panels are containing these huge emotions in ways that are just impossible and unnatural. These images, it's too intense to be depicted in this way, but I didn't have a choice but to exist with those emotions in that environment that was just so oppressive. So talking again about that environment, there's a whole kind of allegory, metaphor thing in the book that's about being on an island, and it was based on something another patient had said, where he had described, I'm not sure what was going on with him, but he would blurt out these phrases, and one of the phrases that he would say was, "We're all on Lonesome Standard Time." And I thought that was just the most profound statement. And so from that, I just sort of realized that it is like a completely different time zone. It's not real. And when you leave the hospital, people act like that wasn't a real experience. Like that was just a blip in your life that like didn't really happen. And that's just how it's treated in my experience. So in keeping with that, this is in a moment where I really had to be in touch with my parents. And if you read the book, you'll find out more. But, I'm depicting, I'm now in contact with the other side. And, here, this is in his, he is talking, this is his reality. And there I am on this desert island, it's not real, it's not really happening. And then here's me in a very real reality having this conversation with him. And over the course of this sequence, there's more pages to it, but something happens and I just end up drowning in the water. Another thing that I do in the book, and this is in the part of the book that deals with my job, is I wanted to indicate the level of otherness that I felt being in this career. And, I had a period of time in this job where I really did enjoy working in advertising before I was promoted onto Pfizer. And things just started to deteriorate. And I started to feel a pronounced sense of otherness. And I also, at that point, I had so many life-ruining experiences with my illness that I was really afraid of myself and, felt this volatility, that I was dangerous. And, being in those situations, I felt this otherness, and I also felt this kind of fear of myself and this primal self that at some point could manifest in these environments. And so I did that by drawing this wolf. And then here, one of the decisions that I made was to have my eyes change in the book. And you'll notice that in these, all of the people who are not having issues and are, on the plane of sanity have these dots for eyes. And that's like, there's stylistic choices that are made around that. But one of the functions of having these kind of eyes, these googly eyes, is that they allow so much room for expressiveness. You have a whole additional line around this dot that you can manipulate. And the size of it, everything was reflective of my changing perception on the world. And so there's a change at a certain point in the book where my character has those eyes. And that's it. So thank you.
So I thought what we could do is,
I just want to ask, do you have any specific, comic creator inspiration to help you design your character, design the world you depicted?
Well, I've been influenced by a lot of cartoonists over the course of time, but for the book in particular, I think I did think a lot about structure and also the prose style and the relationship between the writing and the images. And so for that, there's a cartoonist named Stephen Collins, and his book is called The Gigantic Beard That Was Evil. That book. And then David Mazzucchelli is just an old school cartoonist that has been doing this work for a really long time in a lot of different formats. But he has a book called Asterios Polyp, and if you're interested in seeing just all of the ways that you can manipulate comics conventions to enhance visual storytelling, that is your book. It's like a dictionary. So those two in particular were really important.
Are you afraid that, not particularly afraid, but do you feel that your book won't be respected as highly as others in the fact that it contains comics? Do you ever look at that or have any thoughts about that?
I think that I'm coming out with this book at a really great time. I mean, the graphic medicine certainly is starting to make its way into, higher level thought, and I think that what has hurt me, if anything, is that people think that I chose my style and that my style is inappropriate for the subject matter. Which is so ignorant, because if you understand anything about having a voice, either as a writer or an artist, it manifests itself in a unique way, and that just happens to be how mine does. But yeah, that's been my only concern, that people won't take it seriously because it's too cartoony.
If you could go back to the last slide, yeah. So you were talking about the eyes, and I was wondering, what did you try to portray when you had the dot eyes?
When I had the dot eyes? Just, a uniformity, and that because I feel, bipolar, people who are bipolar experience the world in a way that there's more emotional, playback, and there's a sensitivity about the way that the world is experienced that really is emotionally externalized. And even though I don't think that people who do not have bipolar disorder can't have extreme emotions and be very expressive in the way that these eyes lend themselves to very well, it's just for the purposes of making this clear distinction that I decided to use those for the manic portion.
When you were in the hospital, you said that you immediately knew that you wanted to write this book and tell your story. In that time, in the process of getting the rights to actually make the book, were you not hesitant or concerned about coming out with your diagnosis and sharing it with everyone because of the stigma behind it?
Honestly, not at all. I really felt like this was so unbelievable, and that as a storyteller, more than I never set out to write a graphic novel. I wasn't like, someday I'm going to write a graphic novel. I was a cartoonist. I made comics. I had a comic strip. But as a storyteller, I am compelled to tell stories. And I just knew that nothing would ever occur to me, and hopefully not again, but that this occurred to me in such a powerful way that I knew that I had to do it. I was meant to do this. And it's been interesting because in the time since the book has come out, I've really felt like a profound loss of purpose because this was, I was like hell-bent on doing this. I made it the purpose of my life for years.
Hi, I have two questions for you. So first one, what point in your life did you decide to create an ending for this specific book?
Well, writing it was really hard because obviously the diagnosis portion of my life and all of the events that preceded this were really powerful, and I felt like they were really important in understanding who I was in my relationship to my illness. But for the purposes of this book, I decided to just keep it to this period of my life because I just, again, I felt that this set of circumstances was so unbelievable that anyone who, even if someone didn't have a connection to mental illness, there's something about these things happening that would allow someone to feel that. And I just wanted to keep it tight to that.
Okay, and my second question is, do you plan on writing more sequels?
Well, I mean, I have to say the journey of talking at Harvard Medical School library after being told that I was delusional for not having for wanting to show my portfolio to the New Yorker is pretty unbelievable. And I've had to overcome, I've had to say in the wake of finishing the book, I've had to say, hey, you know what? This didn't solve all the problems in my life. And like, what problems am I left with? And what do I have to do to deal with them? And not to mention all the stuff that I had to do in between 2011 and 2016 to get myself out of my corporate job that I had again, out of New York, you know, through all of the stuff that I dealt with my own self-stigma, and get to the point where, you know, it took a lot. And it wasn't just me either. It's just there's so much to know about the kindness of other people and everything.
Thank you.
So when you were hospitalized, you mentioned that you were angry about it at first. I was wondering if now that you have been through the process, were you happy that you were there? And if you are happy that you were there at the time period, would you recommend a different way to get you hospitalized?
No, I was not happy. I'm not happy about it. I think that the approach that was taken to hospitalize me was wrong. My parents didn't even try to have a conversation with me before I was put in an ambulance. And I was an adult that was not a dependent and had not threatened physical harm to myself or other people, and somehow I was still hospitalized. So I'm not sure to this day how that happened. But I think what was necessary for me was to do exactly what I had done for myself that very day, which was to leave my job and plan to leave New York. Because I'll tell you, ever since I moved to Vermont, I've been fine. And prior to that, I had had a major episode every 2 years. So, you know, just having the respect that you know what you need, and having people in your life be concerned about you, but also have appropriate boundaries, is really important. And I'm grateful that this happened, in the sense that, you know, what I got for my advance would have paid my hospital bill. But I think that it was wrong. Yeah.
Sorry. When you were in like the chug, crush, toss phase, how did you feel about like everything that was going on in your life?
Well, I mean, it's like that cycle, you know, and it's like the idea of reprioritizing, because, you know, I had horrible experiences. I was afraid of myself, so I was afraid to ruin my life, and that was the answer that was presented to me. And I wanted to do whatever it took to make sure that none of that stuff happened again. So it was all just part of my daily life and what I did to take care of myself, you know. Yeah.
I've read a couple of memoirs of mental illness, just written accounts, and the rhetorical tone that is struck in a lot of those is detached, dispassionate, maybe gently ironic, or maybe a little bit sardonic. And what seems different when I'm looking at your images is that I'm wondering what the rhetorical sort of tone is that you're striking in your self-depictions. Because sometimes when I look at these images that you've drawn of yourself, I wonder whether that reflects you as you're looking back on that episode in your life and your attitude at the moment of creating the images, or whether you're trying to depict how you viewed yourself in the moment. It's like there's a possibility that the way you're drawing yourself opens up, you know, kind of ambiguity between how you now are looking back on that episode and how you saw yourself at the time. And I was just wondering if you had something to say about the possibilities that are generated by drawing yourself.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I know exactly what you're saying about the mental illness memoirs, because when I set out to do this, my observation was that there were these two extremes, one being I'm a pariah and I'll never be part of society and I've accepted that, and the other one being I was crazy, isn't that hilarious? With maybe the exception of An Unquiet Mind, which is incredible. But I have had a lot of reactions to this book that it's funny, which is really interesting to me because nothing about this feels funny, even though the drawings are funny. And I suppose there's some humor in them, but like, honestly, this is just like me writing words. And that's how these feelings are externalized and mediated. And, I think it might just be some kind of unconscious coping mechanism. But yeah, I mean, I definitely, like, I'm a cartoonist, and there's different ways that I portray different emotions. And, people have experience laughing at things that look like that. And so I don't know, it's kind of tough for me to answer that. I just really feel like I was putting out what was, going on.
So I just had a quick question about the entire experience and what you would recommend as change for the future of healthcare practice, like practitioners. What is your call to action essentially? Meaning, how can we change the way that we treat this?
Well, I mean, this is something that's come up a bunch of times since I've been talking, to doctors and people that are involved in treatment situations. And I think it really all comes down to this wall of like the fact that we have to pass notes from one another that are describing humans and that have feelings and are experiencing a lot of stuff and maybe not able to communicate that well in that one moment that you share with them before you pass that note to someone that sees them 5 hours later. And I don't know what to do about that, but I really think that's the crucial issue, and certainly with inpatient. But actually, I've been doing some reading about narrative medicine, and the founder of narrative medicine's name is Rita Sharon. And one thing that she does with her patients is that she will write the notes and then she'll give them to her patients and leave the room or let them take it home and just be like, how do you feel about this? And because there should be a co-created narrative between the doctor and the patient. And that the power of that is immense because it all comes down to that respect and agency. I'm looking to you for help, but that doesn't mean that I want you to take over my life.
Yeah, I was thinking as I was looking at your work, how I feel like some of the most interesting books and graphic novels I've read are ones where, you're following a narrative, but there are also this quality that you can add to the narrator where they become unreliable over time, where you feel as though there's something that you gradually seem like, oh wait, I can't trust what this person is presenting to me. And in your doctor's notes, you could see that they didn't exactly trust what it was you were telling them, that there wasn't anything that could be gleaned, that anything that you said could just be thrown out of the window, and that they were the experts, that they were the ones who knew best for you. And kind of in the same vein, I was wondering how you felt this work could improve how people are cared for who are in your situation now. By showing how, I don't know, say you were to contrast your doctor's notes with how you felt as you drew yourself on the clipboard, jumping off it, wanting to take agency back.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel that showing maybe physicians or?
Well, I think that sequence in particular is very powerful for that population because, where is that doctor that's saying this? Where is that person that's taking these notes? They're not there. All they are is this huge hand of God that's placing me into this situation, and that's communicative enough, I think.
Let's take one more question.
created this idea on admission, was this maybe the most major therapeutic thing you had going through your hospitals today? And I guess in the long term, was this the most helpful thing that you got out of the entire situation?
Yes, in ways that I did not anticipate. And I think when I was working on this in the hospital, it was very much like, you know, I mean, it was a nice hospital. Like, it was like the club, it's a joke in the book that it was the Club Med of hospitals, because I've been hospitalized 3 times, and that was nice. And they gave me a sketchbook, but that sketchbook was like my private world where I was taking notes on them in the same way they were taking notes on me. So having that space, that private space to react and to have that history that I was creating was really, really important in that moment. And then as far as making the book itself, like, I really had to, when the book was bought, I threw out everything that the book was bought with. I mean, the pages I showed my agent and my publisher do not exist in the book, because it was about my relationship to other patients in the hospital, and not in a way that sensationalized them at all. Like, I love those people. It was a community. It's a strange situation I can't really explain unless you know, but a fraternity of dehumanized individuals. But I realized that I had approached the whole job portion, since I decided to do it chronologically. And when I wrote that, I said, where am I when I got to the hospital? What is going on with me emotionally? And because everybody wants to know, after having this whole emotional arc up to the hospital, what is happening with you now? Not what are you saying to the other people, and what, you know. So being forced to like really examine that moment was really important, and to like be able to share that with people so I don't have to talk about this anymore. That in itself, it was, you know, as a perfectionist artist, finishing this book and feeling just satisfied, like beat to shit, but satisfied, was immense, because I knew I said what I needed to say. I still haven't had a conversation with my parents about this, like in depth, but they know how I felt, and I feel good about that. It's changed my relationship with them. I don't feel as angry.
Thank you very much. Another great round of applause for this. Phenomenal.
Thank you.
Phenomenal.
Thank you so much.
And Rachel will stick around. Her book is out there. She's going to sign books. Stick around and chat. So.